Okay, so this is video 2 about the thin blue line. I'm going to move on to question number 5, which is, what do you think of Gus Rose and the other Dallas cops, and what do they say about Adams? Do they approach the case objectively? So, there are a bunch of Dallas cops we hear from in the film. You certainly need to know the name of Gus Rose because he's the one that first interrogated Adams. And Adams tells us a story about that interrogation with some very strange and potentially disturbing details, including, you may remember, that Gus Rose walked into the interrogation room and pulled his service revolver on Randall Adams. He slapped a confession down in front of him and said, "Sign this." And Randall Adams refused to sign it. And Gus Rose, Adams tells us, also put a gun down on the table in front of Adams and told him to pick it up. Now, the question then is, well, why would Gus Rose do that? And maybe you're thinking to get fingerprints on a gun. That's possible. Maybe an answer might be that Gus Rose, who has pulled his gun on Adams, wants him to pick it up so that Gus Rose could say, well, I shot Adams because he pulled a gun on me. But it was really a gun that Gus Rose put in front of him. Now, that might make you go, well, why would a cop do that? I mean, if they regularly did that, that would be hard to get away with. But that then raises the question, well, what's special about this case? This is not just any case where he's interrogating somebody for a crime. It's a very specific crime. It's the crime of killing a police officer, which police officers tend to take very personally. And so, now, again, this is what Adams says. So I'm not suggesting, at least initially, that you just take what he says as the truth. We have to decide at some point whether we believe Adams has credibility, ethos, in his explanation of what's going on here. Maybe initially we don't know. Let's just continue a little bit with what Adams tells us. He tells us that the cop points the gun at him for a while, and Adams says, well, if you don't like that I'm not going to sign it, you're just going to have to shoot me because I'm not signing it. And he said, that Gus Rose essentially had the gun pointed at him for a while and eventually put the gun away, picked up the other gun, walked out of the room. But then Adams says that a little while later, I mean, we're talking a long time that they're talking to him, because he at some point says, when I was sitting in that room, I'd smoked 2 packs of cigarettes and had been out of cigarettes for a long time. So, some time has to go by for that to happen. It's probably hours, right? But eventually, Adams says that he gave a statement, a voluntary statement, to a stenographer, took down, everything Adams was saying, like a stenographer is a court reporter, and they typed up a statement, and Adams read through it, and he said, yeah, that's what happened that night, and he signed that statement. We're then told that eventually, Adams went back to his jail cell, and that the police went to the media and said, Adams has signed a confession. And Adams says, I never signed. He said, yes, I signed a statement about what happened, but he said in no way, shape, or form was it a confession. And at some point, Errol Morris flashes it on the screen. And the fact that we actually see it shows us that Errol Morris himself has seen this document. And the suggestion would be, it's obviously not a confession, because if it was, I think Errol Morris would have pointed out that it contradicted what Randall Adams was saying. But I think the suggestion clearly in the film is that that we see that through that the police did mislead the media, and that the word got out to the citizens of Dallas that Randall Adams had confessed to the killing of Robert Wood, so that Adams was essentially tried in the court of public opinion. And Adams says, but I knew nothing about the fact that this was going on because I was in my jail cell and I didn't have access to newspapers or anything. I mean, it might be different now because I imagine prisoners can go online and other. I mean, I don't know how it works, but I would just say, Adams says, I had no idea that they had told the press that I'd signed a confession, but he's saying, but I didn't sign a confession. So anyway, all of that we hear from Adams, and then Errol Morris interviews Gus Rose, and Gus Rose's version of the same interview, the same interrogation was, I had a casual, friendly conversation with him. And he says, I asked him what he liked and what he didn't like. You know, that's his characterization. So clearly by that, somebody's lying, right? There's no way that he pulled a gun on me and we had a casual, friendly conversation. Those are completely opposite depictions of what happened. So it raises that question, do we believe Adams or do we believe Gus Rose? Now, I also, in this question, ask, it says, what do the cops say about Adams? One thing they do is he says, he protested his innocence, and they said he almost overacted his innocence. To say he protested saying I'm innocent, is that something an innocent man would say or a guilty man would say? It's a different thing to characterize it. He overacted his innocence. They're saying he just said I am innocent. Is that overacting, or is that just saying I'm innocent? So that's a question to sort of contend with. Now, as for the question of do they approach the case objectively, and of course, just to clarify what I mean by objectively is sticking to the facts, not making judgments in advance of having the facts. Do the cops approach the case objectively? I guess what I'll say about this is when the Dallas cops finally speak to David Harris about the night in question, he tells them a story about what happened. They had already heard that he had been bragging to his friend's inviter. David Harris had been bragging to his friend's inviter that he killed the cop. One of the friends says that David said, I swear to God I killed that cop. When David is finally talking to the cops in Dallas, he says, I did brag and say that, but it's not true. I'm not the one who did it, but I can tell you who did it. And he told them about what Adams said. Sorry, let me rephrase that. David Harris told the Dallas cops that Adams killed Robert Wood. The Dallas cops, one of them, I think it's Gus Rose, says, he told us the facts of the case, and it matched with what we knew. So we knew it had to be right. So that's the Dallas cops basically saying, we had evidence about what had happened that night. And when David Harris finally stopped saying that David Harris, had committed this crime and changed his story to Randall Adams committed this crime, Gus Rose and the other Dallas cops are saying what David Harris told us fit with the facts that we had, so we knew David Harris's story had to be right. That would seem reasonable. Here's the problem. Later in the film, at one point, one of the same Dallas cops says to us, at some point we looked at what we had and we realized we didn't have anything, meaning no evidence. And then he says, So we had to rely on witnesses, and that's what we did. So when Gus Rose or the other Dallas cops say, we heard David Harris's story and it matched with what we had, so we knew David Harris's story had to be right, that contradicts what we hear later, which is they say, we looked at the evidence we had and we realized we didn't have anything, so we had to rely on witnesses. Now, we haven't gotten to talking about the witnesses yet. But that's a way of saying those two things can't be true. One of them is false. One of them, if the second thing we hear, we didn't have anything, is true, it means that when they say David Harris's story had to be right, they're not telling the truth, or they're missing and overlooking. I mean, it does raise this question: if the Dallas cops, did some things wrong, did they do them wrong on purpose? Did they do it wrong by mistake? Etc. Right? And I think the more you sift through this stuff, there are things that might suggest, what it is. I mean, if Gus Rose indeed pulled the gun on Randall Adams, then they definitely did some things wrong on purpose, right? Because there's no situation in which that's remotely acceptable or even legal. But Gus Rose says he didn't do that. Do you believe him? But when they say David Harris, told us this and it fit with what we had to be right, and then later they say we didn't have anything, those can't both be true. So that's important to think about. Okay, I'm running out of time in this video. I got a few minutes, but I'll just say there's another cop we encounter named Sam Cottrell, and he's the one from Viter, and he has some stuff to tell us about David Harris. I think it's important to remind you that at one point, Dennis White, who is Adam's attorney, he says about Sam Cottrell. Okay, Dennis White is the one that tells us that when he traveled to Viter, Texas, to do a little research about the case, he says, he basically tells us one thing is, I realized I was being watched by people in the town of Viter. He also tells us the town of Viter is the home of the Ku Klux Klan in the state of Texas, or at least was in 1976. I've never been to Viter. I don't know, but apparently that was true back then. So Dennis White tells us when he went there, he was being watched. I think he felt, not only threatened, but he also encountered people in Viter who, when he was trying to discover some of the facts about David Harris for the case and everything, even though David Harris had this long criminal history where he'd committed armed robbery and he'd beat people up and he'd stolen lots of things, including the car that he was driving, the car that involved on the night of the shooting of Robert Wood, etc., etc. When he asked people in Viter, well, what do you think about David Harris? That's where he encountered comments like, well, we're just not too keen on ruining a young man's life. Let's remember that David Harris was 16 at the time of the shooting of Robert Wood. Hey, if a 16-year-old murdered somebody, then, saying we're not keen on ruining a young man's life is not exactly carrying out justice. However, the one person that Dennis White says is trustworthy and reliable is this cop from Viter named Sam Cottrell. You may remember him from the movie. He's the one that keeps telling us stories about encountering David Harris, getting into trouble. At one point he takes David Harris to go find the gun that was used in the shooting of Robert Wood, and Sam Cottrell says he's having to wade through a snaky creek or something, and David Harris is laughing about all this stuff. All of it is to say, I've had students who have said Sam Cottrell's not trustworthy because he keeps letting David Harris go. It's not up to the cops. If the justice system lets David Harris go. That's not Sam Cottrell's fault. I think Sam Cottrell, according to Dennis White, he was the one cop from Viter that was trustworthy. I'm going to have to end there. Maybe I'll make a third video. Thank you.